Welcome back to the channel. I'm Kevin, and today is going to be a bit of a long one. I'm going to be making Il-Hwan's Dagger from the solo leveling webtoon, and I'm going to use it as a chance to explain exactly how I model, print, and finish cosplay daggers. Now, the background for this video is that over the last 5 years, I've made as many as 19 different daggers, depending how you want to count them. And I posted videos for each one, but they've all been build videos. I'll briefly summarize my process, but then I mostly focus on what made the project especially interesting or fun, which is the format I generally enjoy working with. I can't make every video incredibly detailed, or they'd all be 45 minutes long and incredibly repetitive. I have started to feel a little bit conflicted though, because I picked up some useful tips and tricks that I do want to share, but they don't fit into that format. My solution is this video that you're watching now, and I'm going to call this my first ever tutorial. I'm going to go into extreme painful detail on every aspect of my process, and that way I can go back to my normal format without having to worry about missing anything too important. Now, full disclosure, I am a self-taught hobbyist, not a professional. What you're going to see reflects how I've learned to make daggers and what works for me now. But I'm learning more with every new project, which is one reason I've held off on doing a tutorial like this for so long. Hopefully in a couple years, I'll be able to post an updated version and talk about all the things I've learned since now. So if you're watching this in a few years' time, just check the video description to see if there's a more recent video. I also want to be upfront that this is my longest video by a very wide margin. When I sat down at the start of the month and started to plan this out, I thought it would be maybe 25 minutes, which was way off. This was so long that my voice was giving out for parts of it, I couldn't do nearly as many takes as I wanted, and towards the end, my editing software went a little bit crazy from the sheer amount of footage. If something's unclear, or I misspoke and you didn't catch what I said, just drop a comment down below and I'll do my best to clarify. Now with all of that out of the way, let's dive in. Choosing a prop. I have two rules when it comes to making props. Number one, the prop has to be recognizable. I don't want to invest a lot of time and effort in something that's just not worth it. I really like Grimgar, and I've looked into making those weapons, but they're all really generic. I could carefully recreate one of these daggers, and for a more popular series I might consider it, but here, it's just not worth it. If you were trying to do a Grimgar cosplay, you'd be better off focusing on the outfit and using some generic prop dagger that's going to get you 90% of the way with really no effort. I recommend going for daggers and props that have a really distinct design, which is one of the reasons I make so much stuff from solo leveling. People may not immediately recognize Il-Hwan's daggers because they only show up briefly, but with a little bit of context, they should be able to figure it out. That being said, this is the time when I decided I was only going to make one of his daggers. There's a black dagger which he holds in front of him, and later gets picked up by Jinwoo. There's also a white dagger, which we really only see in 2 panels of the webtoon. I honestly forgot he had a second dagger until I was going through the webtoon to prepare for this project. I certainly could make this one as well, but I think the fact I forgot about it is a pretty good sign that I should skip it. On this channel, you'll see me do plenty of inefficient stuff, because this is my hobby and I like making cool things. But if I'm really treating this like a tutorial and trying to get you ready to make cosplay daggers, I think the right choice is to skip this one. The black dagger is much more recognizable and can get you 99% of the results with less than half the effort. Now, if anyone really does want to see me make that second dagger, just let me know in the comments and I'll probably do it in a future video, just not right now. So that's rule number 1, which is a big one. My second rule is it has to be something new. The unexciting truth is that if there's already a 3D model out there for something you want to print, you're probably better off going with that, even if you have to pay a couple of bucks, than trying to learn how to 3D model your own. My exception to this rule is when something exists, but I would have made substantially different design choices. I find this happens a lot with solo leveling because there's so much room for interpretation between the webtoon, the anime, and the various games. I'm not saying any of the models out there are bad, I just might make slightly different decisions than those creators. This even happens with my own stuff, which is why you'll occasionally see me go back and remake a dagger I did a few years ago, because my understanding of the design has changed. Now, for doing something like this, if this is just a hobby, this is something you want to get into, by all means, choose whatever you want, dive in, hopefully have fun. If you have a convention coming up and you're trying to do this for a costume and you have a tight deadline, I think it's really worth considering if you want to go down this path and invest a lot of time modeling something new, or you're better off paying a few bucks for something somebody's already made, even if you might have designed it a little bit differently if you're doing it from scratch. Taking screenshots. Once you've decided that you are going to make something, you need to figure out exactly what it looks like. This generally means taking screenshots from the webtoon, manga, or anime. The main thing you're looking for is a good view of the side of the dagger. I'll cover this more in a few minutes, but the easiest way to model a dagger in Blender is to have a perfect reference image from the side. You're going to need to create one of those one way or another, and if you can find something that's that or very close to it in the original source material, you'll save yourself a ton of time and probably get a better result. I recommend saving as many reference images as you can. Personally, I like naming files after the chapter they were taken from, and if it's the anime, I'll mention the episode number and the timestamp. That way, if I need to get more details later on, I can easily go back and find the spot again. I ended up with several decent images from the webtoon, but none of them showed the entire dagger from the side. I'd say this is a pretty average result. Creating a reference image. Before you go into Blender and start modeling, you need a reference image to work off of. If you have great screenshots from the webtoon or show you're going off of, this is a really quick and easy process. In this case, I don't. So this section is going to be a little bit longer than it normally would be. Sometimes it's as easy as editing together a few different screenshots. Animes love slow panning shots, probably because they're pretty cheap to do, so you will occasionally get lucky with that. This time, I didn't have anything so convenient, so I really had to figure most of this out myself. I had a pretty nice shot of the side of the blade, so I created a red line as a guide and then started lining things up. In addition to a reference of the blade, I had a decent view of what the bottom of the handle looked like, along with a spike on the bottom. This was a good start, but it did mean I had to do some math. Il-Hwan's grip is pretty high up on this dagger, but it looks like there's still enough space for him to get both of his hands on here. I measured my own hands and decided I need about 18 centimeters, or around 7 inches, in order to hold a dagger like this. I decided this point at the bottom should probably be about 4 centimeters, or around 1.5 inches, in order to be a satisfying size. You'll notice I'm using both inches and centimeters, and that's because I'm American. My brain thinks in inches, but centimeters and millimeters are so much easier to work with in Blender, so I always end up converting my measurements and then rounding to nice even numbers. I know from experience that solo leveling blades look best between 22 and 24 inches long, so about 60 centimeters. Since I know the size of the spike on the pommel and the grip, I know that the hilt and the blade will be about 38 centimeters long. I also know that I want the diameter of the handle to feel comfortable in my hand, so I went with 1 inch, or 25 millimeters. I spent some time in GIMP, my photo editing software of choice, rearranging the images and doing a rough job sketching this all out. I chose to make 1 millimeter equal to 3 pixels, which meant that on my digital canvas, I could measure out every single part of this in pixels and know exactly what size that corresponded to. Since I'm making sure my reference is all to scale, Once this is in Blender, I should just be able to trace over it and have everything come out as I intended. Here's the rough draft, which honestly probably would have done in a pinch, but could definitely use some cleanup. Your first draft shouldn't be your final draft. At this point, it's worth going back and checking the references to see if you missed any details. It turns out that I did. In this image, you can see that the hilt merges with the handle in a slightly different way than I originally thought. I did another pass off camera and cleaned a lot of this up, as well as made a few changes. That original drawing probably would have been fine, but if I really want to make something nice, I think it's worth going back and putting a little more effort into your reference, especially because it helps you think through some of those critical details and gives you a leg up when it comes to modeling. This was the final reference, which was ready for Blender. Almost. Sanity checks. I love anime, manga, and webtoons because the art is so often stunning, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. I'm going to use an example from Bleach, which is something I pulled out in one of my earliest videos. I hear what some of you are already saying, and yes, these are technically magic swords which can change lengths, but if you tried to make a prop without double checking, you might end up with dimensions that were way too long or too short. I still screw this up sometimes. A couple of months ago, I was making the Atari's Fang Dagger from the solo leveling webtoon, and I made the handle too small, so I actually had to go back and tweak the design and reprint significant portions. I've also had this issue with the length of my daggers. I'll post them online, and people will comment that they look too short. It doesn't matter that I'm mathematically correct, people expect them to be bigger than they actually would be. Funnily enough, it's actually much easier to manage this when you're doing things from scratch, like I've done in this video, because I've already had to go and do a lot of the math. When you have a really good reference image, it's easy to just go with the flow and end up modeling this without confirming all the measurements. I did make a slight miscalculation though. I sketched the wrapping on the handle on top of the grip instead of within it, so this ended up being a bit larger diameter than I intended. It's not a big issue, but it's definitely something I should have caught. Either way, the moral of the story is to check your measurements before you go too far. It's quick and easy to change things at this stage, but it can get more and more time consuming as you get further in the process. 3D modeling in Blender. Blender is free and great, and there are tons of wonderful tutorials out there which will teach you all of the basics. And this video is not one of them. I am just a hobbyist, I am self-taught when it comes to Blender, and I'm not going to embarrass both of us by trying to teach you the basics from scratch. If you've never used Blender before, I recommend you go and check out 1 or 2 basic tutorials and then come back. But if you have even a passing familiarity with Blender, then this is the video for you. I'm going to start by adding the reference I just made. Once it's in there, I create a cube and scale it up to 630 millimeters, which is the total length of the dagger, and then I scale the reference image up so it matches that exactly. Since I already made sure that everything was to scale in the reference image, which is now resized to be the correct length, I can just trace over this and be confident that anything I make is going to turn out to have the right dimensions. Modeling the dagger, the blade. I like starting with the biggest, most defining piece of a dagger, which is almost always the blade. There might be really weird cases, like with the Atari's Fang Dagger I made a couple of months ago, where you have a super ornate hilt, which kind of steals the focus. In that case, I'd probably put most of my initial work into that piece, but at the very least, I'd still at least outline the blade, since it's what all of your other details have to work around. For you, if you're just getting started, I think you can just make the blade first, and that's not a bad choice. I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of context. To model the blade, I start with a plane, and then delete everything but a single vertices, which I position at the very tip. From there, I extrude it and start working my way down the blade, quickly splitting it off so I have a clear division between the angled edge and the flat of the blade. When I'm doing this, I'm trying to create quadrilaterals with 4 sides whenever possible. For some of the weirder geometry, a few triangles did slip in here, but they have the potential to cause some weird pulling issues once I add the modifiers later on, so it's best to minimize them. My idea here is to disrupt the pattern I'm making as little as possible, while leaving just enough geometry to get this to hook in a satisfying way. I continued down the blade until my plane covered everything. At this point, I recommend you make a backup copy. The next couple of steps can be a little tricky, at least the first time, and it's often easier to jump back to this point and correct things before retrying those steps. Having a backup version now will probably save you a little bit of time. I extruded this by 0.5 millimeters and then by another 4.5 millimeters. I make all of my blades 10 millimeters, or about 2/5 of an inch thick. That's thin enough that it still reads as a blade, while being thick enough that you can reasonably print and finish it without driving yourself crazy. I also don't include a sharp edge. I find that a 1mm flat edge is easier to print and finish, and way more resistant to damage. As for where I'm getting the current 5mm measurements, my trick is I only make half of my blades, and then I use a mirror modifier to create the other half. One thing I recommend doing is turning on face orientation once in a while to make sure that the inside and the outside faces are correct. If they're not, just hit Ctrl-A and Shift-N, and it will generally fix it. Blender tracks what side of the shape is inside versus outside. This is typically automatic if you're working with cubes and other meshes, but if you're extruding a plane, it's 50-50. This can create some weird issues or confuse your slicer, so to get ahead of that, just every 30 minutes or so, click on face orientation and fix it if something's messed up. At this point, I had something that looked like a dagger, but was a little chunky and not sharp. This seemed like a good time to add a subdivision surface modifier, which is my secret sauce. I love the subdivision surface modifier, it's great, I talk about it in every video, and I cannot praise it enough. If you know a little bit about what you're doing, you can quickly use it to turn a rough outline into something that looks like an elegant sculpt with very little effort. That's what all of this has been working towards. The subdivision surface modifier will curve over every edge, which I don't really want, so I need to go through and crease the ones I want to stay crisp. This is what a current cross-section of the blade looks like. My next step is to delete the topmost edge and then crease the inner edge, so I have a clearly defined flat of the blade. Then I'll go through and reconnect everything so I get that nice angled edge before mirroring it, which is the last step. This took a few minutes, but I think it's worth it. If you watch my older stuff, you might see me doing a simplified version of this. I used to just extrude it and then scale the entire top portion down to create that angled edge, which was faster, but didn't really let me prepare for some of the weirder bits of geometry. Doing it this way takes an extra 5 minutes, but it can save me more than an hour of troubleshooting. This is suddenly starting to look like a real blade. At this point, you can go ahead and start tweaking this to your heart's content. The reference image and the original art should get you 95% of the way there, but this is the time to figure out if it looks a little bit better if it's curved more or curved less. Don't worry, just make sure to hit Ctrl-Z if you do something you don't like, and have fun adding your own little twist to the design. This is also when I try to sharpen the tip by reducing the thickness slightly. This is generally a lot of tweaking, and it doesn't always look amazing in Blender, but I promise it'll look much better than you think once it's printed. You may see me adjusting a point with my mouse and then typing in the exact amount I want to move it, which is generally rounded to the nearest half millimeter. I do this when I know I'm going to be coming back and tweaking things after a significant amount of time, when Ctrl-Z isn't going to help me. I generally only do this on flat surfaces because curved surfaces involve too much tweaking, but for the flat surfaces, like the thickness of a blade or a tip, it can be helpful to work in discrete increments. Before going any further, I want to show you 3 tricks. The first has to do with creating really nice and satisfying points. The subdivision surface modifier will try to make everything a gradual curve. So if you want dramatic points like this, you need to put another set of points pretty close so you can control this. You can also make the flat of the blade as one face instead of dividing it into a bunch of smaller parts, like I've done. You just need to make sure there aren't any nooks or crannies which could confuse the subdivision surface modifier. For my third tip, what you see here is a great way of creating a dagger with a well-defined edge. But if you're doing something that doesn't have a clear flat edge like this, you can just uncrease this top edge and you get a more rounded look, which is actually much easier to finish and print, so I recommend you do this wherever you can. My last piece of advice, which doesn't even rise to the level of being a trick, is to really embrace the power of trial and error. Blender makes it easy to save your current version and try messing around with something. You can easily run through several experiments over the course of an hour and probably learn a lot. That's my favorite way of learning new skills, and Blender makes that really easy, so go wild. Okay, so to finish out the blade, the last step is to mirror it, which is going to use the mirror modifier. After you're done with this, you should look around the edge. If one of your edges isn't properly creased, it will look like this. It's easy to fix, but can be hard to spot, especially once you start adding more details. So now's a good time to check. You're also going to want to make sure you label your pieces before you move on. I normally label things as the part name, a dash, and then whatever the current stage is. So I would generally have blade-plane and then blade-extruded. This is something I didn't really fully appreciate when I first started, because you don't really need to name all the parts until you really do. Just every once in a while spend 10 seconds labeling things, and you will eventually save yourself an hour of frustration. Modeling the dagger, the hilt. Now that the blade is done, or pretty close to it, I get to decide what I want to work on next. My main priorities are either the hilt or the handle. The spike on the bottom of the handle is pretty self-contained and not likely to cause too many problems. But the handle and the hilts might give me a bit of an issue. You see, the benefits of working off of a reference is I can easily trace over it, and that makes sure it's perfect from one direction. For things like the handle and hilt, they'll have a fair amount of thickness, so things might not line up the way I intend. I started by blocking out the handle and the hilt, which gave me a sense of what this was going to look like. I realized I need to square up the bottom of the blade a little, so I quickly made that adjustment. Life would be so much easier if every dagger had a nice square crossguard. Solo leveling doesn't really do that, which is one of the reasons the daggers look so cool, but it's also much more challenging to work with. Around this time, I decided to break the hilt into 3 different pieces. There are some hints of this layering in the art, but we can't really see it from most angles, and Sung Il-Hwan's hand covers it a lot of the time. I figured that a nice scaled look would be great here, and dividing this into 3 different pieces was going to make that easy. Once again, I started with a plane, and then moved along tracing my reference, exactly like what I did with the blade. I extruded this so it was a 0.5 millimeter higher than the blade, so it was distinct when it came to printing and finishing this, and then dragged the center up to create an angle. I wanted this to curve, which isn't possible with just 2 sets of points, so I had to add an additional cut here and adjust those points accordingly. Then I went ahead and creased the edges so I could apply a subdivision surface modifier. So far, this process is about 80% identical to what I did with the blade. I mirrored this and had a weird overlapping effect. That's because I moved the origin when I was shifting points around, and it's being mirrored from the wrong spot. That's an easy fix by just setting the origin back to the 3D cursor. And while I'm at it, I also realized I forgot to crease this point, so I fixed that. I followed the exact same steps to make the next piece. I decided I wanted the height difference between these to be about 2 millimeters. I knew that less than 1 millimeter wasn't going to work, because it wasn't going to be noticeable enough after this was printed. I could have gone for 1.5, but I decided to go with 2 for now, knowing I could change it later. To To get this contour to curve nicely, I used my mouse to position the points exactly on the surface, and then added 2mm to that. I really liked the point I made on the middle piece, so for the final piece, I decided to just copy the middle piece and try heavily modifying it. It turns out I needed to redo so much of this that I just went back to a plane and started over, which was pretty quick and worked out well. At this point, I decided that 1mm would be better than 2mm as a height difference between these pieces, so I went back and quickly modified that. I do want to share one trick I've learned about how to deal with a warping surface. When in doubt, just take the surface that looks weird and start moving your vertices up from underneath the surface till they sit on or just above that surface. Repeat as needed, and this will basically average out these points, which generally looks better. In this case, I'm not trying to round any of my measurements to the nearest 0.5mm, like I was with the thickness at the tip. I don't bother on curving surfaces because it's so much tweaking, there is very little value in that. Honestly, at this point, I wasn't sure how I felt about the hilt, but I knew I could tweak it later, so I decided to move on to the handle. Modeling the dagger, the handle. In a perfect world, all dagger grips are smooth with no detailing. There have been a few like that I've done, but generally there's some pattern or detail you need to work around. In the past, I've handled this in one of two ways. First is actually wrapping the daggers in fabric or cordage to match the original reference. I think that in most cases, incorporating other materials into your daggers is going to make them more impressive. The reason I've stopped doing it is because I like to distribute my files, and part of what makes all of this fun is seeing people 3D print my work. I found that people on Thingiverse would post makes, but they wouldn't wrap the handles as I intended, which is totally fine, but I want to make this as easy as possible for them, which is why I now try to 3D model every detail. If this is your first time doing this, and you're not planning to distribute your models to dozens or hundreds of people, I would recommend that you go with the cordage or fabric if that matches the original reference. I think that's going to be easier, both in terms of finishing and modeling, and is probably going to give you better results. Just as an example, I'm going to show you how I would wrap a dagger using this piece of dowel. If you're actually planning to wrap one of your finished prints, I recommend you practice on something like this first. Fabric and bandages can be pretty forgiving, but cordage needs consistent tension or it'll just become a glue-covered mess. I generally start by applying a 1/2 inch of glue running down the handle in 2 to 3 different spots. Then I wrap whatever material it is around this until I've covered that section of glue. I put my thumb on it to maintain tension and give it 2 to 3 minutes to dry, maybe watching a YouTube video in the meantime, before continuing on. This process takes a bit of time, but it's not especially complicated. It'll cost you maybe $10 in materials, but it will save you a ton of time and effort. If you are planning to wrap your handle, then just create a cylinder with a diameter of 25mm, then shrink that down a little bit to account for the thickness of the wrapping. If you are going to 3D model it, then your approach really depends on what the details on the handle are. In this case, I'm dealing with a bandage wrap, which is fairly easy to do. I start by creating a cylinder and deleting off the faces on either end, then going back and reconnecting them into a bunch of small faces. The subdivision surface modifier won't be able to work with a single flat face, especially after I adjust all these points. But by dividing up, I'm creating a bunch of quadrilaterals, which it definitely knows what to do with. I then adjust the points to trace the design. I also added a series of cuts I could scale up to make this taper off a little bit more dramatically. When I'm scaling this, I'm not just hitting S and scaling everything at once. I'm hitting SZ to scale the Z dimension first, which matches up with the reference perfectly. Then I'm scaling in the X dimension to make sure it's equally thick. I don't want to scale this in the Y dimension with my points rearranged like this, because it would undo all the work I just did. I did some tweaking to get this to line up with the blade and the hilt in a way I liked. This included adjusting the hilt a little bit to get things to line up, just so, although I knew I might come back and alter this more later. I created some of the larger pieces and then started working my way down the handle. These early pieces took me about 5 minutes each, just because I was trying things out and figuring out what looked good. It got faster as I could just copy, paste, and modify these. At this point, it's worth clarifying that I'm not doing all of this in a single sitting. I am very much a hobbyist and I don't have the stamina of a professional 3D artist. So I'm doing 10 or 15 minutes and taking a break to read a chapter of a webtoon and then coming back to do a little bit more. If you're new to this, I recommend you give yourself plenty of time. So if you get frustrated, you can call it for the day, walk away, and come back fresh without trying to push forward and probably making some mistakes. I carried on down the handle and this part was pretty much done. Now, some of you may have realized I actually cheated a little bit here. This handle is supposed to be wrapped in cloth, but I didn't actually do a winding pattern. That's because it's not going to matter. Doing it like this, I'm able to dramatize some of the wrapping, which makes it feel more faithful to the webtoon. It's also not something people are going to notice unless they're spinning this around in their hand, which probably isn't going to happen if this is up on a wall for display or being used as part of a cosplay. I kept going until I got to the bottom, at which point I used a scaled sphere instead of a cylinder to cap this off. The flat end of a cylinder generally doesn't look great, even with the subdivision surface modifier, because there's this weird tugging effect. A scaled sphere is going to be your best bet for capping something like this off. Now that the handle was done, I could move on to the pommel. Modeling the dagger, the pommel. This was the exact same process I used to make the blade, except on a much smaller scale. This is a good example of how just these few techniques can really build on each other. As long as it has a sharp edge, you just trace it with a plane and extrude it. If it's round, you start with a cylinder and adjust the edges from there. That will cover most of your basic daggers. Modeling the dagger, exporting. Now you have your full model, which is great, except how are you going to print it? Now it's time to divide this up into smaller pieces, which can easily be printed and assembled. I start by positioning some cubes over the model, each of which represents a single piece I intend to print. My basic cubes are 150 millimeters, though I might stretch the dimensions a little bit. My printer could technically go larger, but since I'm trying to distribute these files to other enthusiasts, I like to keep it in a more reasonable size that will fit more printers. I did carefully adjust these dimensions to make sure they didn't intersect any critical details. I'll talk more about this in a couple of minutes, but when I do divisions between pieces, I want to make sure it's either a flat surface that I can easily finish and disguise, or it's an area that no one's going to spot that join. If possible, I'll divide things where two flat pieces meet. I did this on a Night Killer dagger, also from Solo Leveling, and it made printing and finishing super easy. That's not a great option here because of the design for the dagger, so I'm just doing the best I can, which means doing most of the divisions on the flat blade, which will be fairly easy to disguise, and then one on the handle, where it will hopefully be covered by your hand or lost in some of the other wrapping details. Once I figured out the sections I'm going to do, I start dropping in biscuits and holes. It's incredibly frustrating to print something and try to glue it together, only to have it spin around or fall apart during gluing. So I always try to add something to help out in that process, and little effort now will save you a lot of frustration later. The biscuits are about 20 millimeters in diameter and 5 millimeters thick. The holes are a half millimeter larger in each dimension, so there's a 1/4 millimeter tolerance on each side. I could honestly make this a little bit tighter with my printer, but once again, I'm distributing these and I don't want to make this a nightmare for anybody whose calibration isn't quite as good. For the blade sections, this is really simple. I just do a Boolean intersect modifier to copy where the blade intersects with the cube, and then do some Boolean modifiers to cut in holes for the biscuits. This is supposed to be the easy part. I ran into issues with Blender not wanting to apply the modifiers properly, so instead of cutting away the shape, it added it on instead. I rearranged the order of these modifiers, and eventually it worked. I don't have a really technical explanation for why this happens, but if you do, please drop a comment down below. What I do know is if Blender's being cranky, try rearranging some of the modifiers, and that will often jolt it out of it. This isn't so much of an issue on Daggers, but as you move on to larger projects, this can become more of a hurdle. So just something to watch out for. In other areas, I had to make multiple copies of the cubes, and then use a series of intersect and difference modifiers to shave away some parts while including others. This was not particularly difficult, it just took some trial and error. This really only applies to things that cross the borders of the different cubes. For geometry that falls within it, I can just toggle it on and off normally. With a bit of time, I finished this, but I can't really guarantee it's manifold. I run everything through Repetier Host to repair my models. I'm sure there's ways to avoid having to do this, but I'll happily ignore them in exchange for letting Repetier Host do its thing for about a minute. This is also when I'll adjust the model's orientation to make sure it will print properly. It turns out I forgot to check the face orientation on that last pommel piece. That would have been faster to fix in Blender, but I don't really want to have to export this again, so I'll just get it fixed here. At this point, you're ready to print your models. Printing. I started by printing just one piece. A couple of years ago, I bought a Bamboo P1P, which was a huge upgrade from the printer I built myself for my kit, which was never really calibrated very well. It has reduced so many of the problems I've had with printing and has been one of the best purchases I've ever made. Currently, really the only problem I often run into is that I need to change out the desiccant in my filament. So after not printing anything for about 6 weeks, because I was doing a different type of project last month, I start with one piece just to see if it works. It did, which means I'm clear to go ahead and print the rest. I don't actually have much else to say about this. There are much better YouTube channels out there for general printing advice, but I do have a few tips for what to do after these are printed. Assembling your prints. To start off with, be very careful when peeling supports. I use all sorts of sharp tools and adhesives when making stuff, but most of my hobby-related injuries come from peeling 3D printed supports. I've gotten bits in my eye before, which was absolutely miserable, and I'll pretty routinely scratch up my fingers. My advice is always wear glasses or safety goggles. That's pretty good advice for pretty much anything hobby-related you're doing. Aside from that, keep tools nearby. I find that when I'm trying to pick at stuff with my fingers, I'll often slip and scratch myself, but if I'm using a proper tool for it, I tend not to hurt myself nearly as much. It's a really basic thing, but it comes up a lot more than you'd expect. At this point, I could start thinking about gluing, which meant busting out my painter's tape. Like every maker, I have that tool or product that I swear by, and mine is painter's tape. This stuff is just so much more useful than it should be, and I never regret having it around. Now, also like other makers, I have Amazon affiliate links in the video description down below, in case you want to buy some painter's tape or anything else you see in today's video. It's a free way to support the channel and helps me pay for the cost of filament, supplies, and stuff like that. After test fitting everything, I apply glue and put the pieces together. Then I use tape to secure everything while it dries. A lot of glue was squeezed out, which I managed to get on my hands and glue my fingers together, which was fun. You can get thick and thin superglue, which are both useful in different circumstances. Normally I would use thick superglue, but I had a little incident with my bottle and I haven't restocked yet, so I only had thin superglue lying around, which is why I had so much squeeze out. I glued these joins in the first round and then came back to glue everything together in a second round. I generally try to only glue 2 things together at a time because I get better results and it tends to be a lot less stressful. I have done 3+ at a time, but it's generally a disaster and I avoid it unless I'm under a huge time crunch. In addition to tape, you can use various clamps to help hold some of these flat areas together. If you do this, I just recommend putting some painter's tape on the gripping surfaces so you can easily deal with any glue squeeze out. Depending on what you're building, you can even use rubber bands to hold these pieces together while they dry. This is fairly easy when you're doing the intermediate assembly and have flat surfaces on both ends, but if you're doing a dagger with a bunch of hooks and barbs, you can sometimes get things around those and secure it in really nice ways. Finishing. Once the glue dries, it's time to peel off the tape, which may require a knife, depending how much glue squeezed out. This is generally when I start sanding. There are some rare cases where I'll start sanding before gluing everything together, but that's generally only if areas are going to be inaccessible once everything's assembled. For this dagger, it's not going to be necessary, but I did want to mention that as a piece of context. My first priority is to sand the joins between the pieces. No matter how careful you are, there's probably going to be a slight difference between these pieces, which might become noticeable after it's painted. I want to minimize this as much as possible by sanding, and then use wood filler to cover it all over. You can do this by hand, but it's faster to use a Dremel tool. I'm going very lightly and moving perpendicular to the join to try to get a uniform rough surface on both sides, which means I've shaved down any possible lip. If you have any other areas you need to sand, whether due to printing issues or damage from peeling the supports, now is when you can get started. I didn't really have any of that just because I have a pretty nice printer, but that wasn't the case a couple of years ago when I was using a home-built one. It's pretty much the same process I'm going to cover here, just in a smaller scale on a lot of different spots. Once I've done my initial round of sanding, I apply wood filler. I've tried different sculpting tools and such, and I found that my finger and a toothpick are the best ones. Occasionally, I'll throw a popsicle stick into the mix, but that's pretty rare. At this stage, I'm applying pressure with my finger to make sure this gets into every crack, then applying maybe a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch more than I think I need. So everything is definitely covered, but I'll have minimal sanding to do when I get back to this. You're going to see me use wood filler, but you could use Bondo or any other sandable agent of your choice. At least with wood filler, I let this dry overnight, just so I don't run into any wet patches when I start sanding. The next day, I came back and started cleaning this up with a knife. I could just do all of this with sandpaper, but using the knife to shave some of these areas means less work and also less dust. Then I'll dive in with some 120 grit sandpaper, although it doesn't have to be exactly that grit. One of my biggest tips when working with blades is to make sure you do long strokes, which will get you better results with less effort. The joint on the handle is much more annoying. It's the same process as I'm using on the blade, I just have a much smaller area, so my tricks to save time and energy don't work nearly as well. This is when a set of small files can be really helpful. I bought some years ago at Home Depot, and they've been great for working in small areas like this. One thing to be mindful of at this stage is preserving your sharp edges. With wood filler, it's easy for those areas to become slightly filled and eventually rounded over, which is not always what you want. When you're applying wood filler, you can use a tip of a toothpick to clean out these areas, or if it's already dried, you can just use the side of a knife or a chisel or a file. Just pay a little bit of attention to it before applying any primer, and you'll probably be fine. Next, I applied spray-on primer, which also fills small cracks. This stuff is great and I recommend it, but it's not a magical solution. It's going to take something that is pretty good quality or something you've already sanded and make it look a little bit better, but it doesn't replace sanding entirely. I sprayed the top 2/3 of this and let it dry overnight. The primer really makes the rough areas visible, so I went back to sanding and applied a little bit more wood filler in areas which needed some help. For the next coat of primer, I busted out my painter's tape again and attached a loop to the tip. This let me hang this from a hook in my garage so I can prime most of it without having to worry about how I'll let it dry. I primed the lower 2/3 this time, so it's all had at least one coat on it so far. This actually let me speed things up a lot. Your results, in large part, are going to be determined by how many rounds of primer, wood filler, and sanding you go through. On my first coat, I didn't prime everything, but I did manage to prime all of the joins, which meant I could go through and do another round of wood filler and sanding. On my second coat, I primed the areas which I'd missed previously, plus I did another round on both of those joins, which is what needed the most work. This means I managed to prime every part of this, which is a prerequisite for painting, but I also got to do 2 rounds on all the rough areas, in just 2 coats. This may not sound like a lot, but when I first started, I would apply the wood filler, and then do spray on primer on one half, and then spray on primer on the other half. So everything was totally primed before I went back and did more sanding and wood filler. This meant that for every round of sanding and wood filler, I was doing 2 applications of primer. This way, I do 2 applications of primer and get 2 rounds with wood filler and sanding, which cuts down my priming time by about 50%. My last round of wood filler and sanding were pretty minor. This is where I busted out the toothpicks to apply it just to specific areas. On this pass, I put some on the edges of the cloth wrapping, where the filament texture was pretty obvious. I also applied some to the bottom of the grip, which I had previously missed and was a little rougher than I wanted. I sprayed this once more and secured it from the middle of the blade, where everything was looking good. I did do maybe 3 extra minutes of sanding after this final coat of primer, but that was it, and I felt pretty confident starting to paint. I could have kept going, but I wasn't too worried about it since I'm going to be painting most of this dagger black, which is a very forgiving color. Metallic colors and light colors really make imperfections pop, but black will cover them all pretty effectively, so even if it's a little bit rough, it'll look just fine. Painting. I always try to start with the lightest colors, which in this case was the white on the edge of the blade. I'm able to start with a really sloppy coat with the light colors, because I'm going to be painting this over in black later, so I can easily cover this up. The silver goes on really well over the gray primer, but still takes more coats than a matte paint. I went through and carefully applied white along the edge of the silver. This was good practice for the really hard part, which is the black. I started by carefully painting the edges, which took me 10 to 15 minutes per side. I normally use really cheap brushes, like $4 a pack, but a couple of years ago, I actually spent $6 whole on a set of smaller brushes for this exact purpose, and it's been a really good investment. Afterwards, I went back with a larger brush to fill in this middle section. I went back and did a second coat, but I didn't do a perfect job, so I went back in with the tiny brush to clean this up with the white. This doesn't necessarily look the best up close, but it's not going to be obvious from a couple of feet away as part of a cosplay. There are other approaches to painting daggers which might give me slightly better results, and I do hope to experiment with them one day, but at least so far, every time I've had a chance, I've just sat down and started making a new dagger instead of spending time carefully investigating new techniques. I do hope in future you'll see me branch out more and hopefully have more suggestions on the topic, but at least at this time, this is my best way of doing it. Now it was time to move on to the base color for the handle. I went ahead and used these smaller brushes around the areas I had already carefully painted. But then in the middle, I went back to using a large brush to speed this up. When I made my first dagger, this is pretty much where I called it quits. It looks alright, but nothing special. There are a couple of ways to make this shine, quite literally. I started by mixing another color for the handle, which was pretty much the same, but was 30 to 50% metallic paint. I started with the little brush again, and then switched to a larger brush. I was determined to do this as a single coat, because this is a color I mixed myself, and I'm not good at mixing colors, so I wasn't sure I was going to be able to recreate this if I had to go back and touch anything up. This is also the reason that you want the base coat underneath this to be as close a match as possible. So if you do miss any small areas, they're not noticeable because the color difference is almost non-existent. When this dried, I realized I didn't like the color, so I had to go back and redo this, which isn't ideal, but does happen sometimes. I went ahead and applied a coat of the matte metallic mix for both the black and the white. I think this technique has a lot of merit, but this isn't the best example. I find it works really well for dark brown tones, such as wood. In hindsight, I maybe should have chosen a different dagger that would have shown this off better, but I didn't think of it when I was starting this project, and at this point, I'm way too committed. My final step was applying a clear matte sealer. I needed some way to let this dry between coats, so I was wandering around my workspace and noticed that the handle fit nicely inside a roll of paper towels. I ended up just sticking the handle in this with the blade pointed up, and it was pretty stable. So that let me spray the blade, let it dry overnight, and then come back to spray the handle. To let the next coat dry, I loosely wrapped the blade in paper towels just to protect it from any dirt or debris on my work surface, and then used a clamp to roughly hold it on the table. This suspended the handle midair, which was perfect for letting it dry. And that's the last step. So we can move on to the final chapter, and I'll give you my thoughts. Final thoughts. If I'm really being honest, this isn't my favorite dagger, but I'm okay with how it came out. I showed this dagger from Ari Monster earlier, and it's my main point of comparison for this. This dagger was much smaller and required far less finishing, so I was able to do a slightly better job at painting that black edge. If you saw this up on my wall or at a convention, I don't think you'd pick up on any of this. But as the creator that's been looking at it from 6 inches away for many hours at this point, it's still gonna bug me. I'm also not totally satisfied with the color of the handle. I don't love how this turned out, and I'm realizing now that most daggers I make have dark gray or black handles, which I think I prefer more. I tried to be as faithful as possible to the original reference with this one, but I probably would have made different design decisions if I were doing this from scratch. Still, at the end of the day, I'm happy to have this as part of my collection. If you've stuck around this long, I hope you'll give the video a like, and if you want to support the channel or see my other work, then go ahead and subscribe. I'll post all the files on Thingiverse in case you want to make your own. Just check the video description down below for the links. I'll be back next month with another video, so until then.